Hey guys, this is Patrick Carl. You might know me as the guy with the most IM medals in the world, or something like that. I'm also the CGO Fnatic, and you're watching Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. Yeah, pleasure being here.
Bjorn Wall, aka Bullen, is one of the forgotten great Swedish Counter-Strike players, in part because he didn't have a long enough professional career to accomplish as many of the great things as his talent seemed to hint at. But while he was playing and while he was in top teams like Spixel, like Eyeballers, he shone so brightly. It was clear he was a very talented individual. Sadly, he left/retired from the scene at the time, bizarrely, but it later emerged that he unfortunately had leukemia, or rather got leukemia later on. And on August 19th of 2011, he died at the tragically young age of 26 years old. So first of all, let me talk about Bullen as a player so you can get an image in your mind of what a great player he was, and then you can kind of see his career, how it played out, and why he didn't get to the heights that perhaps he should have. So he was someone who had really nice aim. Like his first bullet, nice as fuck. So as a result, he had a very sick USP. In 1.6, you tended to spam the USP. So his first bullets would be really accurate. Then he'd spam a whole bunch of them. He'd get the kills very often. He was a really good pistol on player. He had good long range aim, hence that first bullet aim being good. But if he was anywhere mid to close range, he didn't burst, he didn't tap. What he would do is, he's the kind of player who sprayed the way you are supposed to in the textbook. You make sure the crosshair is onto them very clearly, then you spray it in 1.6. So he would get the crosshair on first with the first bullet, and then, for example, with the AK, he would spray full auto. He would just spray the entire clip, drag down, he was good at it. And particularly with the unsilenced M4A1, he was fabulous with spray with that weapon. Really, really good spray. And as a result, if you tried rushing him close range of multiple people, he's gonna get 2 kills at least. That's how good he was. He also, on top of all of that, was a good AWPer. Not some like outrageously good AWPer, but again, he had good long range aim, so he could land those shots. Pretty good single scope AWPer. His style of play was quite interesting because in an era when a lot of people would like to play aggressive Counter-Strike, he was a bit baity, a bit campy. Essentially, he's what we'd now call a lurker, but back then it was just a slow-paced play, you know, something of a Grims. He walked a lot, he stayed around angles a lot, he tried to use sound cues, creep up behind people, but as a result, as you'd expect if you know in CSGO what lurkers' strengths tend to be, he was a very good clutch player. Often won 1v1s, 1v2s, again, because he had really nice aim and he knew how to use angles. As such, he was a breakout player. He was a big fragger. He's someone who topped the scoreboard and did well in big games against big teams. So in light of this profile I've just given you, it sounds like a fabulous player, right? Why didn't he accomplish more than he did in his career? Well, aside from the tragic ending of his career, let's talk about it. So back in 2002 to 2003, he's coming up through the scene. He's playing online in Sweden. He was just an online player. He actually played in the early days in a team called West Coast, which is the one that famously RWA came from, who was something of a legendary AWPer, but who didn't really get a chance on LAN until a couple of years later himself. You had a player called Bever, who later played in Eyeballers. You had I think Neb was in that team, perhaps, who later went on to Gamers.new, and also some later on squads such as Kaya. You had Kalipo, who later played with Big Grip. A bunch of players who were like semi-pros around the Swedish scene, known players. The problem is, playing in these teams, you're just going to get a rep if you're good that you're an onliner. So when he then played in Come As You Are, aka Kaya, this was an infamous online team. Like every edition they had of this squad was known for getting big upsets, doing really well against top teams, but only in online play. He was someone who's playing in clan base a lot, which was a community online ladder. And as such, like Vilden, the legendary Eyeballers, later on NIP and the SK Gaming player who won a number of majors, he's someone who actually said he was surprised that someone like SK in those days of 2003, 2004 didn't pick up someone like Bullen. Now, he did in 2003 go to some lands. For example, he went to CPL Copenhagen, one of the big CPL Europe tournaments with HLO, Highland Online Kaya. He only finished top 16 there, not a particularly great performance. So coming into 2004, they had a thing there. It was called like the Svensk Rankering or something like that, which was like basically the Swedish ranking where people in the community would vote who they thought the best players were. And already in 2004, before he'd accomplished much, he was getting on this ranking and he was being highly rated. So in early 2004, 2004, he joined a team called Spixel, where he was playing with Valle, was the most famous player. This obviously is the guy who'd been in Lulan and who'd released those movies, Bröderna of Wallenberg, Brothers Wallenberg, with him and his brother, where it's just some of the most naughty online and scrim clips you've ever fucking seen of them just no-scoping everyone. So everyone was hyped to see what Valle would do. There was also a few other players who would go on to later on to do things like Eyelight, etc. Now, funnily enough, in this team, Valle was certainly very good, but he was so outrageous in his movies that online actually often didn't live up to that billing. Bullen, on the other hand, was bonkers. He really was the breakout player in this team and quickly showed himself to be one of the best Swedish players. Because at the SEL, Swedish Esport League, which is an offline league where you played matches from cafes online, but with very low ping. And then the finals was like, I think top 3 or top 4 teams played a LAN finals. Now, past seasons had obviously been won by teams like SK Gaming, Heaton, Potty, etc. Fabulous squads. But in early 2004, in March, season 5 was won by CaYa. And they were a team that had similar lineup, Bullen. This is before Spixel gets going, so he has to play out the season with this squad. So there's Bullen, Kalipo, a couple of players you won't know, Chair, Neb, but I also had Hyper, who'd been in the previous Highland Online, who was an amazing individual player and at times in-game leader in his career for this squad, later on for Eyeballers, where he won the CPL, and eventually for SK and into NIP, where tragically his career ended much earlier than it should have done. Now, they won this tournament. During the season was when they played a game against Adrenaline. Now, Adrenaline was Westerlund's team with Quick and Lucchese and Executor, a really skilled squad who admittedly had only finished top 4 at the last CPL, but the core of them had won ESWC the previous year, Click Arena the previous year, finished second at CPL Summer. So some of the best players in the world, some of the most decorated players in Counter-Strike at this point in time. And in a game on Train, this is where Bullen really broke out. It's like, this guy has talent, because his team wins 11-4 on T side of what is a very CT sided map, and one that Westerlund teams has always been good on CT side. And he goes 23-7 on the T side of that map, finishes the game with like 29 kills overall. They dominate completely, one of the best teams in the world. They get to LAN, and it's the same story. They play against Adrenaline in the playoffs, beat them 16-8 on Dust 2. They go to the final. They play Karn and DSN's experienced Sweden, beat them in overtime, and win the Swedish Esport League. So you can already tell there's something going on here with this team. Then, about a month later, they went to Rendezvous 10, which is a Swedish LAN, and at this point in time, they already have the proper Spixel lineup, and at this tournament, one of the key victories was they beat Westerlund and Company, which was a mixed team made up of Westerlund and Quick from Adrenaline, and Fisker and Spawn from SK, and Salido, who I can't remember what team he was in at that point in time. He later was in ICSU, I Can See You. So they smashed this team, really shocking result, beat Virus in the final, won this LAN. They won a small LAN called Krang Party, so you can see he was attending a lot of LANs around this time. Now, sadly for World Cyber Games Sweden, they didn't manage to qualify for the qualifier, so they weren't going to be able to play there. Later it would be SK that represented Sweden. But right up next, this is all packed within the same few months, was the ESWC Sweden qualifier. It was SK and Ornage and Spixel who went to ESWC representing Sweden, and Spixel lost to the SK squad twice and went along with Ornage, who they'd beaten, to the finals. So at ESWC, you've seen some solid results. You've seen some good results in Sweden, but no one could expect what was going to happen here. Because in the first group stage, they lost an overtime game to Astralis, the Finnish team, and then they took care of everyone else. They got to the second group stage. They beat Ornage, the other Swedish team. They beat Factory, a French team. They beat MIBR, the Brazilian team, who'd yet to do any great things. Then they went to the playoffs. In the first round of the playoffs, they played Adrenaline, the team they'd beaten already on LAN. They smashed them again on Train, 13-3. Semi-finals, they played TSG, who was an American team who'd been a surprise qualifier, actually, but had some very skilled players in their team who'd go on to do some great things, like Volcano, Storm, Sunman, fabulous players there, Dominator. In the final, because this is a 13-11 win on Dust 2, in the final, ESWC a major, they played against the Titans, a surprise finalist. Sadly, they lost 11-13 on Dust 2, so Bullen was just narrowly denied winning a major in his first ever attendance. After this, you go back to Sweden. They play in the Swedish Esport League again. They get to the final again. There was some controversy over who was there. He played his old team, CaYa, in the final. They won that, and so he won back-to-back Swedish Esport League titles. Okay, the league was winding down in terms of importance now, but still legit LAN wins. Later that year, his team went to Oslo LAN, which was a team in Norway, funnily enough in Oslo, as you might imagine. And they used Mini Wally, Valle's brother, instead of Hyber, because Mini Wally had offers to join better teams. So he said, like, if you let my brother play in this team, I'll stay in this team for a while. His team managed to win the LAN, despite in the upper bracket losing to a Norwegian team, Clan IT, which had a bunch of talent in them. Went to the lower bracket, beat Clan IT in the rematch, got to the final where they played NOA, who at this point in time was using Element's friend Naal as a stand-in, and they had Executor, who hadn't officially joined but was a stand-in as well. And Spixel managed to win 2-0 over this super skilled mixed team. They won 16-8 on Inferno, 16-13 on Dust 2. So everything looked great. They won this LAN. They won as their prize a kilogram of gold, which I believe they just sold and actually converted into money anyway. Not long after this, about a month later, was another Nordic LAN. This was Nollelva in Sweden. This was the one where everyone remembers, shockingly, this ICSU team came out of nowhere with a bunch of players who'd never been at the top level, beat a bunch of the top teams. But in the end, it was SK Sweden with Hyper and Heaton and Potty who won the LAN. I think maybe Potty didn't play at that LAN, I'm not certain. Actually, it was only ICSU and SK who beat Spixel. ICSU smashed them on train, shockingly. They fought back. They beat NOA in the lower bracket. They got to the lower final where they played SK. It was an overtime loss on train. SK went on to win the tournament in the end. At this LAN, they also took a different lineup. Minivalley was still there, but they also took RWA, who was obviously an old teammate of Bullen's and was replacing Eyelight in this team. Now, at this point, Eyeballers decided to make a drastic roster move because they'd lost Hyper to SK Gaming. So they made a big time move and they brought in Bullen and Valle from Spixel. So that meant you had Archie, Vilden and Gooden, some of the core of the Eyeballers team that had won CPL Summer a few months earlier and beaten SK in the final there, one of the majors. And they brought in Bullen and Valle to make kind of something of a Swedish super team. I mean, some of those players aren't super team players, but a very good team. They went to DreamHack Winter as a tune-up. They won easily against not very good opponents. Online, the hype was these guys were wrecking everyone. And Vilden confirmed it to me in an interview years later. Coming into the tournament, SK wasn't going because SK was in contract disputes with their org, and the org decided to send the German team since they knew odds were the Swedish team was going to leave, as it did later, and became NIP. So actually, NOA came in as one of the heavy favourite. Eyeballers came in as one of the heavy favourites for this CPL since NOA hadn't done as well at these previous tournaments with Element when they'd gone to CPL Summer, had bombed the LAN, had bombed the SWC. They had yet to have this really huge result to showcase that talent could actually make it and win the tournament. So NOA was one of the favourites to win the event. They easily cruised through the first few rounds. They beat Green Berets 16-5, MTW 16-5. They played NOA in the upper bracket semi-final. This was a very controversial game because NOA was winning on Nuke T-side, a very CT-sided map, 5-1, but then they did one of the infamous flash bugs where a flash goes under that box at the ramp room, I think from Jaguar, and the rule back then was if you do this once and it effectively goes off, because under there it would hit a skybox and flash everyone in the whole map, you may give up all the remaining rounds. So even though NOA was up 5-1, they lost the half 10-5, despite only actually losing one round to Eyeballers. So with a 10-5 lead, Eyeballers was able to convert it when they got on T-side, win 16-8, and they continued on the upper bracket. NOA had to go to the lower bracket. In the upper bracket final, Eyeballers surprisingly faced off against Gamerco, the core of the rival squad that had come third place at the last CPL. They beat them easily 16-6 on Train. Train was always one of Bullen's best maps because it's based around angles, knowing where your opponent is, playing a little bit lurky, having long range aim. Now, in the final, they played against NOA, who came for the revenge match. In the first game, it was a narrow 14-16 loss for Eyeballers. They were so close to winning the CPL. In the second game, it was a massive blowout. NOA won 16-5. Now, in this final, The first game was so close, and NOA had to win a couple of huge clutches. Method won that ridiculous 1v3 at B. Shagwa won a big 1v3 at A. Without these clutches, Eyeballers probably wins the CPL. Bullen himself had a couple of good rounds. He actually had one where he helped win a 2v3 at the B site. He played pretty well generally, but this was obviously a tournament of destiny for NOA. They were the first team ever to actually come from the lower bracket and win a CPL, so bad timing for Bullen in that sense. So at the end of 2004, Bullen had been a standout, really good all-star player. He'd had some really good performances on LAN against the top Swedish competition. Sadly, at the two majors, despite making both finals that he was in, he wasn't able to win. He had his heart broken in two really close games. Otherwise, might have been a two-time major winner. Coming into 2005, he stayed in the Eyeballers team, and initially they went to a tournament called Optihack in Sweden, but they only placed top 6. They placed 5th to 6 because they lost in the upper bracket to a team called Skol-Pojana, which means schoolboys in Swedish, and this was a squad that had DSN, Zad, Sniden, Zafe, Neb, so some pretty good players who'd been around the pro level. Not many of them had accomplished big things aside from DSN, who'd actually managed to place, I think, 4th at CPL Winter, the one that the Eyeballers team had come second at. In the lower bracket, they make it all the way through until they play a team called Embrace, who beats them 16-10. Embrace had players such as Forrest, Tentpole, and Roban, future Hall of Fame level players, and 3 of them who would be in a team called Big Grip and would win WEG Season 2 a few months later in the summer, but at this point in time were unknown and didn't have all the members of that lineup. So they only finished 5th to 6th, and this caused the team to split apart. So Vilden left for a great offer from NIP, which is a super team at the time, where Hyper, his old teammate, was playing. Valle left for MTW, an all-Swedish lineup, some of the ICSU players. Gooden went inactive, and so Eyeballers was looking for new players. They brought in Zafe, Speedy, and Zad. Zad had been on the Skol-Pojana team that had beaten him. Zafe had also played in that one, and Speedy had been in ICSU. Unfortunately, the team didn't do very well. They got eliminated quite early on at a tournament called Rikshack, way before they should have done, losing to a Danish team. And so that was very disappointing. Roster moves were made. DSN and Khan joined the team, Zafe and Speedy departing from the lineup. So at the ESWC qualifier for Sweden, sadly, the team was unable to qualify. They beat NIP, who at this point in time had Valle, then they lost to ICSU, close game, and then they lost heavily to NIP, and so they didn't get to go to ESWC this season. This was one of the few actually good performances that NIP had at this point in time after they'd initially made their big move and their super team had failed. The team went to the Game Gun tournament at that point in time called Yuskul Game Gun, but only finished in 3rd place. They lost to Team 64 from Germany in a very close Dust 2 game, and they lost to Existence, not the French player, a Spanish team with famously Musambani in a close game as well. So they only finished 3rd there, quite disappointing. NIP won the tournament. On paper, they should have been the second best team. They should have been able to come second here. One of the big tournaments that killed this lineup was they went to the WEG European qualifier, where I think you only had to finish top 3, I think it was, or top 2 to qualify for the World Esports Games Season 3 and go to Korea, live there for a month, compete there. Now, at this tournament, the 3 teams that would end up representing Europe was shockingly the Finnish Wings team of Lurpus and Narsu, the Asylum team from Denmark of Zonic, and NIP of Heaton and Potty. So what happened was, in the group stage, things started great for Eyeballers. They smashed NIP, revenge against Valle again. They lost to NOA, so this was actually not the lineup with Method and Shagwa. At this point in time, it was an all-Nordic lineup with like Executor and Dark and Speedy and a bunch of those players. Then they beat the Russian X4 team. They beat Fnatic as well on Dust 2. This was a DSN team, but Khan had not yet joined yet. Khan was actually playing for Eyeballers now. They lost to Wings, and then in the deciding game to see who would go in the last spot to WEG, they lost to Asylum on Train, which was Zonic's team, and failed to go to this tournament. After this, Khan left the team, went and joined Fnatic, where he joined up with DSN. Forrest joined the team. Tentpole joined the team. They made a team that core of which would go on to be legendary. Now, at this point in time, Bullen went inactive. No one heard from him for a while. He was playing other games. He was a hardcore gamer. He was a guy who had some weight issues. Clearly, he was something of a nerd. But in 2007, he suddenly came back. In early 2007, NIP had an amazing 2006. They'd been the team of the year, even though they hadn't won the majors. And Zet, the best player in the world at the time, left the team to go play in the CGS with Complexity. Inns left to go and join Fnatic to replace the outgoing Archie, not the same Archie that had played in Eyeballers. And so there was a couple of spots left in NIP. And so what happened was NIP recruited Bullen, who'd been inactive, Configure, who was a Norwegian player, talented player, Mini Valle, Valle's brother, and Heaton came back from inactivity. Now, the team only played one LAN. They went to the SEC qualifier for Sweden, which was to represent Sweden at the Samsung European Championship, like a European version of the World Cyber Games. They lost to SK Sweden in best of 3. SK had actually something of a whack lineup at the time, but they lost to 2-0 in a best of 3. Then they lost to Fnatic, which was Inns, Forest, Khan, DSN, etc. And they lost that 0-2 and got utterly smashed there in 2-2 games. So as a result of this terrible LAN performance, Bullen and Configure were kicked. Tentpole and Face were added. Tentpole had left Fnatic a few months earlier, and Face was a rising talent, I think possibly from Big Rip. And funnily enough, when they got kicked, actually Configure, who also got kicked, even said, I hope that Bullen continues. I have no idea why he had to leave, because to me, he was the best. I haven't talked to him since he was kicked, though, so I don't know what his plans are. That would actually be the end of Bullen's career. Now, the sad thing about this is a guy where he had couple of majors he was in the final of. He had a lot of talent. Everyone acknowledged it. All his teammates I talked to, DSN in an interview, said that he was a really good player who could have he actually picked him as the player where if he could have had better teams or played longer, he would have accomplished more. Vilden also said he was a very skilled player, could have been in better teams, but his problem was he didn't take the game seriously enough, playing games like World of Warcraft, etc. There's actually a line from DSN at the end of the text interview I did with him on Fragbite in about like 2012 or something, which actually is one of the few like heart jerker moments I've ever had in an interview, where he actually said, I miss you, Bullen. See you in Nangijala, brother. And Nangijala is a mythical, like, fiction world that these children from a very famous Swedish folk book go into. So it was a very heartwarming moment. Now, sadly, obviously, I think it was only a year after he was actually kicked from NIP. He was diagnosed with leukemia. 3 years later overall, he died. And there's actually a tribute page, I'll link it in the description box below, to this guy with some pictures of him, etc. Tragically short career, someone who maybe didn't have the full professional mindset and therefore didn't dedicate himself 100%, and also just swerved at the wrong moment in some major finals and therefore didn't get that big trophy he really wanted, despite being an excellent player for a year or two, especially within the Swedish scene, but also internationally. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Caesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.